Oh, yeah. Part 2. Here we go. Other topics on the chapter. Once again, not really going over the test this time, just going over the notes. Because, I felt like that was morally wrong or something. Something was just off about it. So anyway, we're talking about the civil rights movement and Vietnam today. The two also kind of overlap a little bit. We'll start with civil rights, though. Starts in the 50s, keeps on trucking in the 60s because that issue of racism in America isn't solved in just a couple years. Hasn't been solved for a couple centuries either. But in the 60s, you get more nonviolent protests. At the beginning of the 60s, you got the sit-ins of 1960 in North Carolina, where you've got college students, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, organizing to sit at the Woolworth lunch counters, where they are met with violence. Remember, they have to break the law peacefully for this protest to work, so they sit there. And then people come and basically try and rip them off the stools. The police come, arrest them, but somebody else takes their place, and they just absorb the violence with their bodies. And it's effective because Woolworths, they end up integrating their lunch counters. You got the Freedom Rides of 1961. This one's organized by a group named the Congress of Racial Equality. And their idea is to test the Supreme Court decision that bus segregation is unconstitutional. So basically, after the Montgomery bus boycott decision, a lot of the places in the South were still segregating their buses and their bus stations. So these people, black and white riders, would ride on the buses together into the South and to see, what's going to happen. And, I'll tell you what happened. They got the crap beat out of them, and they were all arrested. Their buses were bombed. The Ku Klux Klan, assaulted them at one of the stops. And then at the end of the day, they all got arrested and thrown in prison. But there's a problem there because they didn't break any laws. They were riding on a bus with somebody that had a different skin color than them. And people in the South, they just can't have that. Now it's gonna be something that we can't have that down here. And so they went ahead and arrested them. And the Kennedy administration actually had to step up and get them released from prison because that's definitely violating their rights as human beings. So that was an important protest. Also, the Birmingham campaign, also very important. 1963, led by MLK. The most segregated city in America was Birmingham, Alabama. And so they went and did a bunch of nonviolent protests in Birmingham. And the sheriff, Bull Connor, he was a very violent fella. Used attack dogs, and fire hoses to shoot at the protesters and sick on them as well. Didn't help that those protesters were also children. And so they were shooting fire hoses at 10-year-olds, which not a great look. And it was broadcast on the evening news across the country. Kennedy actually said it made him feel sick and made him, think about at least doing something about civil rights, even though he would never get the chance. But at the end of that protest, Birmingham became desegregated. That's a pretty big victory. March on Washington, of course, that happens in 63, where everyone gets together in Washington and kind of celebrates the achievements so far. You have the I Have a Dream speech. But you also have all the different organizations kind of coming together to highlight what they've done. Another important protest is the Selma March in 1965, where the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee goes to Selma, and they're going to march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery. And they are met with Alabama state troopers, and the state troopers end up attacking the protesters. on a day called Bloody Sunday, where they're just standing there nonviolently, and they tell them you must go home or go to your church. And they stand there, and then they unleash the state troopers on horseback with billy clubs and tear gas, and it's not great, especially for the protesters. And after that, Lyndon Johnson steps in and says, like, this can't happen. We gotta help these people. And so he ends up sending in federal troops to protect the marchers. And then, a couple of weeks later, they actually have the march all the way from Selma to Montgomery. MLK joins the march at that point. It's a very famous march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And it was to highlight voting rights. And that was the march that eventually helped LBJ pass the Voting Rights Act, or sign that into law. So pretty big deal in terms of helping out the movement. But at this point in time, we start to see that even though laws are being passed and important changes are being made legislatively, and there's not a lot of advancement being made economically for African Americans in the country. So we see a shift halfway through the 60s from nonviolent protest to this idea of black power, which is fueled by the ideas of Malcolm X, who was a member of the Nation of Islam, of course, who preached about black self-sufficiency and defending oneself, and not really caring to get together with the white population. And so in 1966, you get this idea of black power, which is popularized by a guy named Stokely Carmichael, who was the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And it was a shift from integration, which was MLK's thing, to a focus on self-reliance and empowerment. You also see the formation of the Black Panther Party, formed by a couple of guys named Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, who were law students. And they advocated for self-defense against police brutality. And they kind of promoted community programs like free breakfast and free health clinics. And they definitely liked the Second Amendment. They would open carry, sawed-off shotguns around to make sure that they were protected. They would also follow behind the police to make sure that they were following procedure. And if they weren't, they were going to let them know. They got into plenty of shootouts with the cops back in the mid to late 60s. It was also a time of promoting black heritage and African heritage, and growing out afros, wearing Afrocentric clothing, and that was all about being proud of being black. That was the Black Power movement. Also, a focus was trying to keep money within the black community. So if you could support a black business over a white business, you would and you should, so that money stays within your community and you can help build up your fellow African Americans. This period was also marked by some urban riots and unrest. You've got some in the Watts riots, a very famous one. After MLK is killed in 1968, there's a lot of riots after that, understandably, because people are very upset. And then in 1968, you've got the Black Power salute with the fists in the air at the Olympics by a couple athletes named Tommy Smith and John Carlos, to protest racial injustice. They actually took away their medals because of that, but they eventually returned them over time because they realized, well, that's silly. We shouldn't be taking away medals over that stuff. So there you go. There's the civil rights to Black Power movement. Some of the Black Power leaders that are influential are Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, like I said, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, and a woman named Angela Davis, who was associated with the Black Panther Party. But yeah, a lot of the focuses there are self-defense, self-reliance, supporting the black community, being proud of being black, and focusing on economic needs in the black community. And that's kind of going to do it for the civil rights of the 60s. Let's go to Vietnam, where America gets involved back in the 40s with Harry Truman by sending aid to help the French forces fight against Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. After that first war is settled and the French and the Vietnamese have a peace deal called the Geneva Accords, they split the country in half. North Vietnam is communist, South Vietnam is democratic. The U.S. is going to help prop up South Vietnam. The North is run by Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is going to start sending in a communist guerrilla force into South Vietnam because there was supposed to be an election that united the two halves, but it never happened. So Ho Chi Minh's like, all right, I'll make it happen. We're going to unify this place. And the U.S. was like, no, you ain't. And they supported South Vietnam for quite a long time. After that, we got Dwight Eisenhower and Kennedy sending military advisors in to help South Vietnam fight off the communist forces. And then under Lyndon Baines Johnson, we have the Gulf of Tonkin incident where North Vietnam supposedly bombed some American ships, but some more recent research and journalism has uncovered that that might have been completely fabricated or not really as big of a deal as it was made out to be, because the U.S. was doing some stuff in North Vietnam, kind of covert operations. So North Vietnam shot a torpedo at one of our ships, and Lyndon Johnson was like, oh, yep, they shot us with a bomb, so we're going to war, baby. And so LBJ really ramps up the military involvement in the Vietnam situation. He starts out by bombing the crap out of North Vietnam. That's called Operation Rolling Thunder. The idea was if we just use our firepower and bomb them into submission, this thing will be over by Christmas, as they always say. But it was not, in fact, over by Christmas. There is, like, if you watch a video of what this looks like, it's kind of insane the number of bombs they drop out of those airplanes. But they bombard North Vietnam, but turns out North Vietnam is pretty dedicated to the cause of one Vietnam. So they rebuild everything that gets bombed, and Rolling Thunder doesn't really work. But as Rolling Thunder is going on, we see attacks on South Vietnamese/American air bases by communist forces and the guerrillas, the Viet Cong. So the U.S. sends troops to protect the air bases. And then from that point, the next step is sending in troops to engage the enemy. And that's where we start to see the actual Vietnam War takes place, where the U.S. troops seek out the North Vietnamese and they engage in battles. But the problem is that this is not your typical like war where you would win and take over the land, because these battles took place in the middle of the jungle. So you win, you take over some random patch of the jungle that doesn't really do you any good. So they would have these battles. The U.S. would usually win them, and they would win. They would judge that based on body count, which wasn't a good measure because there was lots of bodies to fight for North Vietnamese independence and Vietnamese independence in general, and they were willing to die for it. So we were using that to measure our victory or our progress, and we were winning according to that metric. So basically every battle the U.S. would end up winning, but it turns out that they had a lot of gas left in the tank that we didn't know about. So in 1968, this whole time, Lyndon Johnson's been saying, like, hey, we're winning every battle. This thing is going to be ours. They're almost done. They're almost near defeat. And then in 1968, there's something called the Tet Offensive, which is the largest offensive of the war by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. It's a coordinated attack. It lasts a few days. The U.S. and the South Vietnamese troops do end up winning the entire, or like militarily being victorious in the Tet Offensive. Kind of providing a Tet defensive, if I may. And It's a military victory for them, but it's a psychological victory for the North Vietnamese because it showed the American public like, hey, these fighters have way more left in the tank. And this thing is far from over. So this is where people turn against the war in large numbers, and they lose public support. And you see a lot more people start to protest the war, including veterans of the war. And you just start to see a overall failure of people's commitment to containment or trying to fight communism in this case. And then you get eventually America deciding that we don't want Lyndon Johnson anymore to be running this war. And he ends up actually leaving the election in 1968, which is one of the crazy events, along with the Tet Offensive, that makes it one of the crazier years in U.S. history. Back home, there is an anti-war movement going on as well. You've got important protests like the Students for a Democratic Society organizing things like teach-ins and marches. You've got these draft riots or draft protests where people were burning their draft cards or fleeing to Canada. One of the more famous opposers of the draft was a guy named Muhammad Ali, who basically argued, like, I'm not going to go fight in Vietnam. Ain't no Vietnamese person ever called me the N-word. Meanwhile, back here, people be calling me that all the time. So I'm not going to fight to protect their rights for anything. Tell me I'm going to go fight communism. Give me a break. And so he went to jail for that. But he stood for what he believed on, stood on business, as they say, I think, nowadays. And then as time goes on, Lyndon Johnson, like I said, he's out of the picture. Richard Nixon gets elected on the idea that he's going to change strategies in the Vietnam War and basically end it. And he does end up winning. That's also because you see the death of the guy who was probably going to win for the Democrats, which was JFK's brother, Robert Bobby Kennedy. But he got killed while running for president. That same year, you also see the death of MLK, which leads to riots across the country and basically the death of the most important leader for the black community. And on top of that, there's riots at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, basically because of the Vietnam War. And Nixon ends up having to run against a guy named Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota. But because Hubert Humphrey is too connected to Lyndon B. Johnson, he was his vice president, he's not going to win the election. Nixon steps in, and he's got a little bit of a different approach to Vietnam. People think he wants to get us out, but eventually what he does is like he ends up amping up bombings of places like Cambodia and Laos and doing so kind of secretly. But that's where all the stuff was coming into South Vietnam, was through those countries. So he bombs those areas. And then he has this idea of Vietnamization, where he's going to kind of give responsibility to the Vietnamese and pull the American troops out so that we can be out of the conflict. Eventually, that's what happens. They end up making a peace deal where you see basically the end of fighting between the two sides, and you still have a North and South Vietnam, and it stays that way for a hot minute. But then Richard Nixon gets involved in something called the Watergate scandal, which forces him to resign the presidency. And because he resigns and the next guy takes over, Gerald Ford, that means that the peace treaty is pretty much negated. And then after he leaves office, North Vietnam just storms South Vietnam and takes over the place in like 2 days. And then you have one Vietnam, which is what it is still to this day. As the North are invading the South, there's this mad dash to get people out of South Vietnam because they worked with the U.S. during the Vietnam War, and they're most likely going to be killed by the North Vietnamese if they're caught. So yeah, it's all in all not a great situation for a lot of people in South Vietnam. But the war is over. Vietnam becomes one country, and nowadays the U.S. and Vietnam were all on good terms, and apparently if you go to Vietnam, there's not a lot of people that care too much about the war at all, like they care about it here. And it's more important here because it was an example of how the most powerful military on the planet ends up taking an L from a country that is fighting a guerrilla war. And it goes to show you that the motivation to fight in a war usually matters more than the amount of firepower you have. If you're willing to outlast your enemy and keep sending people in to fight for your cause, you're probably going to win. And the Vietnamese people, or at least the North Vietnamese people, wanted independence. And, the U.S., they weren't fighting for independence or for some evil force to take over the world. They were fighting basically to make sure they didn't die, or their best friend didn't die, or they just got home safe. And that's not usually a great way to win a war. If you're not willing to just go out there and die for the cause, you're probably not going to win. So the North Vietnamese were definitely willing to do that. The Americans, not so much, which is why the U.S. takes the L in this one, which causes kind of a loss of military confidence. We also see, lots of PTSD from these returning soldiers, and they're not treated very well once they get home. They're called baby killers because of things like the My Lai massacre, where they definitely did kill babies. And there was photos taken of it and everything, which is, a bad look for the U.S. military. In that situation, the war deeply divided the country, continued to erode the trust in the U.S. government because there were some things that they lied about during the Vietnam War. And then it kind of stopped America from getting involved in a lot of these conflicts because they didn't want another Vietnam on their hands. The Vietnam War officially ends in 1975 with the fall of Saigon, like I said before. And there we go. That's the Vietnam War for you. 1968 is a key year. It's also in your notes. I mentioned all the American stuff that was happening around the world. You've got a lot of anti-war protests in places like London, Paris, and Tokyo. Places in Europe are also protesting labor conditions in like Italy and France. Mexico City, they're protesting as well as students. And the government of Mexico ends up massacring them just before the Summer Olympics that take place in Mexico City. You see a rise in feminism around the world. It's just all in all a pretty eventful year with a lot of stuff going on. Transformative decade. And it's one of those paradigm shifting decades that kind of splits or takes a hard turn of where we're headed as a country.